Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of That Early Childhood Nerd. I'm Heather Burnt-Santy. Fellow nerd Tiffany Pearsall is here also, and we're both really excited. I talked over your hi, but we're both really excited that Elliot Haspel is on with us today. So Elliot, would you please tell folks about yourself, and then we'll jump into this piece you wrote for Early Learning Nation.
Sure, happy to. So I'm a childcare policy nerd. I am an author of a book called Crawling Behind America's Childcare Crisis and How to Fix It. I'm a commentator and writer and on a lot of different early childhood and childcare issues. Professionally, I've worked in early childhood policy organizations. I've worked in philanthropy doing early childhood work, and I currently serve as the director of climate and young children for a think tank called Capita, which is really focused on the future of child and family flourishing. And I'm the dad of two young kids, so also very
important to the conversation.
Yeah, also important to the conversation. Yeah.
Yeah. So some listeners will remember that you were on a couple of years ago when Crawling Behind was kind of first out. And if they want to find more about you, they can search that. But we're gonna ask you to talk with us, Elliot, about this piece you wrote for Early Learning Nation earlier in the month, called Elliot's Provocations: The Minimum Viable Child Care Fallacy. So just to start, we're gonna do our format where we have to have a quote first. And so this is from the very beginning of your piece. And you wrote, "I dislike the economic case for childcare. I'm not talking about my take on the role of employers, but the near constant way lawmakers and advocates of both parties rest their case for supporting childcare on its function as an economic driver. Instead, I think we need to reposition childcare as essential to family freedom and national prosperity, a driver of societal health and well-being." Agreed. That got us from the beginning when we were sharing this in our group chat. I'm really just uncomfortable with the idea of putting economic pressure for our whole society on the shoulders of children younger than 5 years old. 5 and younger. But so would you just speak to that a little bit? Like, what brought this article on for you, and what do you mean?
Yeah. I've been thinking for a while about the fact that like the economic case for childcare has come to really dominate the way that we talk about it. I mean, it is in almost every single article you read about it, almost every single statement by an elected official or an advocate is how much we need childcare for the economy to function. And I think there's a history to that we can get into, of like where that came from and James Heckman and
yeah, please,
what was happening before that. So let's talk about that in a minute. But and what I say in the second paragraph is like, that's not wrong, right? Like, it is an economic driver. However, like, there are consequences to making that your dominant rationale. And the main consequence is that if all you're trying to do is make sure that parents can work, then you actually don't need a particularly good childcare system. You just need, as I call it, the minimum viable childcare system. It doesn't actually really matter what's going on inside those childcare centers. The quality doesn't really matter. The affordability doesn't matter as much because, it's okay so long as it's kind of adequate. It doesn't have to be enormously functional. It just needs to not be super terrible. And so, if that's your logic, then like, why would you pay an early childhood educator $50,000? All you got to do is make sure that like we are, not completely letting the bottom fall out on the supply. And there are all sorts of other consequences of that. And so this piece was trying to push back a little bit and say, like, I think we may have let the pendulum go too far in the direction of the economic case to the exclusion of other arguments which actually lead to high quality, sustainable, really good system that works for parents, that works for kids, that works for providers.
Yeah, we're having a lot of this conversation in my community. I'm in Indiana right now, because there is a tremendous childcare need. We've got a lot of employers around the table with us now, with some of the nonprofit folks and some early childhood folks from the community, and the conversation circles. And it says we need to get our people back to work, and our people can't go back to work until there's childcare. But there won't be childcare until our folks are paid more to do it, but then it also has to be high quality, but nobody really wants to define high quality, and we just
Right.
keep going around and around. And I understand the idea that when you're trying to advocate for something, you need to figure out which aspect of that something is going to connect for your audience that you're
Right.
so you're right, it's not wrong to have this economic argument, but it's, I don't know, it's part of a cycle that just, or a circle that just keeps going, and I'm not seeing an end in sight.
Right. And I think that's a great point, actually, that we don't see an end in sight, right? Because I sometimes say, like, follow this to its conclusion. Like, is there a credible path if all you're doing is making the economic argument to a childcare system where we're putting in collectively several like $100 billion a year versus like our K-12 system, right, which gets $700+ billion a year. And without that, you're never going to be able to actually pay educators well, have the supply you need, right? Because at Burn the Piece, the issue now is, okay, so childcare is stuck at $13-14 an hour median wage. The Amazons and Targets and Walmarts and Chipotle's of the world are up, 17, 18, in some cases $20 an hour. And so, the conclusion would then be, okay, all we have to do is get childcare to be slightly less terrible, right? So instead of making $29,000 a year, now you can make $34,000 a year. Great, we did it, right? Like, we're good. And if in the future that those wages go back down in the competing industries, right, and then like presumably it's cool if childcare wages go back down also. And it's this kind of twisted, it's this very capitalistic free market logic, which we've, I think, as childcare advocates and sort of rode that bandwagon to some, success. But again, there are costs to choosing to ride that bandwagon, because we're not controlling where it goes all the way.
Right. We got so excited that we were part of the conversation suddenly that we forgot to sort of contribute our own expertise to the conversation. I think sometimes as early childhood folks. Tiffany, are you waiting to get in with something? I just want to make sure we.
Oh, I'm just really enjoying this conversation. At this point, I'm just listening and saying,
Okay.
yeah. Yes.
All right. So you mentioned a second ago, Elliot, talking about how we got here and talking about the Heckman equation. So is this a good time? Do you feel like?
Yeah, sure. I mean, quick history lesson, right?
Yeah.
Like, so after Nixon vetoes the Comprehensive Child Development Act in 1971, like childcare kind of goes into the wilderness, right? Like, it is not a policy priority. No one's it's kind of getting little bits of subsidy here and there. But by 1994, you have, reports coming out calling it like a silent crisis. You're like, it wasn't that silent like 20 years earlier, but now it's a silent crisis. People just stop talking about it, apparently figuring, well, women are entering the work, like mothers of young children are entering the workforce in droves. There's no childcare system there to meet them, but we're just not gonna do anything about that and just sort of assume that the parents and mothers are gonna figure it out.
Right.
Was basically, I mean, like, I'm being a little bit hyperbolic, but not that
not a lot hyperbolic.
Like, it kind of was the
no, yeah.
And so, so mid 90s, right, it's called silent crisis. It is barely getting any attention. And then, by the 2000s, the Heckman equation comes along, and all of a sudden, this is my sort of reading back. I was not in the field at the time. Like, I think people were like, hey, this works. Now, instead of saying this is like a women's issue, instead of saying it's a child development issue, like, we can say this is an economic issue. Because, by the late 90s, we had 2/3 of all kids under the age of 6 of their, all available parents are in the workforce. So, it's pretty easy to make that argument. And so, I think you saw this huge sort of surge of interest in that argument. It's also worth mentioning that that's the same era that you're talking about, like No Child Left Behind, like the accountability era and K-12 education. Everyone's very obsessed with like metrics and like measurements and ROI. And again, like, we can go too far in the other direction, but so it fit, it very much fit in that conversation. And I don't know that, again, it was as critically examined about, is this actually an argument that's going to get us where we need to go, or is this just an argument that gets us in the room, to what you were saying earlier?
you know, um, so there's capitalist concern with this. There's also patriarchy comes in here. Like
my
the
two favorite
economic
topics.
argument is maybe going to be more appealing to the people who are actually in power.
Right? Like, who are you speaking to when you have
Yeah,
these conversations?
yeah.
Yeah.
Not you,
And
Elliot.
I wonder a lot too about how suddenly a child enters kindergarten and like now it's a community problem, but up until that point, it's like, well, you chose to have kids, so
Yeah.
Yeah,
figure
well,
it out.
exactly. That's a great point, Tiffany. I
Like,
mean, I think
why does that change?
yeah, and this is something that uh I linked this article a lot because it's one of my favorite articles come out in the past few years. Bryce Covert had this article back in like 2020, I think it was the heart of the pandemic, maybe 21. And she said it was titled "School is," and like parentheses, like whisper it, like a form of childcare. And it was like, basically it is this verboten thing that we talk about that actually school has a childcare function. It has always had a child care function as one of its reasons, and we don't like talking about it. I was a public school teacher, and I can tell you public school teachers don't like talking about it.
Absolutely.
And I interviewed like Randy Reingarten and superintendents, and they who's the head of the American Federation of Teachers, and they don't like that argument. They do not like it being pointed out that school is childcare because it feels devaluing, it feels like disrespectful, like all the things where you're like, well, that's interesting, let's unpack that. Like where the way that we think about care. But if 0 to 5 is early care and education, I've argued before, you could easily say elementary school is middle childhood care and education, right? And then high school is adolescent care and education. We just lop off the care part of that. But some of it is interesting, and this is sort of my point, is that when you think about how much money flows into K-12, when you think about the sort of where it situates in the sort of American mind, all of the problems that our public education system has acknowledged, it's interesting that you don't see that. The argument isn't we need public schools so that parents can work. Right? And so why do we think that we need childcare so that parents can work is the winning argument for us.
That's a good point. And I really saw that thinking specifically about like social media and memes and quotes that got shared around when people were trying to decide if schools were going to reopen during COVID and when they were going to reopen. And the economic argument did come in a little bit then for schools because parents needed to get to work. They couldn't be doing Zoom school at home anymore. And I did see so many elementary school teachers being really offended by that. And a lot of that school is not childcare kind of meme stuff coming out. And it was interesting to me. It's like, we're saying the quiet part out loud now.
Yeah, I wrote a whole article. I wrote an article with the New York Times back then about like because the childcare programs all reopened, or many reopened within
or stayed open. Yeah.
Some of them never closed, right?
Yeah.
And that was my other argument. Like, why is that? And it brought up these old schisms, these old ways of thinking, and just like shown a really harsh spotlight on them. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So going back to just I've got a lot of highlighting, but I'm still just in this first opening paragraph of this. But you end it by saying that we should reposition it as a driver of societal health and well-being. Yeah. And that was a big part of your Crawling Behind book, was that it should be a public good like K through 12, but not operating like K through 12.
Yeah.
So will you talk a little bit about how is it a driver of societal health, and how would that change the argument if we focused on that more?
Yeah. So right, childcare, in addition to all of its work supports, right, it provides this foundation for stability in the family, right? And so when you have reliable, good child, and then again, to your point about this being pluralistic, like I'm talking, when I say childcare, I mean of any kind in any setting, stay-at-home parents, grandparents, family childcare, formal programs, whatever you want. Like if you have good, stable childcare that you feel comfortable with as a parent, it unlocks a lot of things, right? And it's affordable. It unlocks your ability to continue to have the work and care situation that you want, right? So that if you want to be able to go or that's where you get meaning from, and then you're able to do that. If you want to be able to work part-time, then you're able to do that. If you want to, it reduces stress significantly, right? Like we know, and there are very tragic stories out there, and you can read parents saying like, I'm dropping my kid off at this place, I know it's not good, I know it's not where I want them to be, and I have to feed my family, and so what I have to do, and yes, and I worry about it all day, and so that's it's an enormous amount of stress. We see it infecting freedom of choice in a lot of ways, and what I mean by that is like families' ability to live in the community they want to live in and invest in their local community, in their neighborhood, in their faith community, like is very much tied up in a lot of cases to questions of childcare. There was a small town in Vermont that did like a study, and this was like a 3,000 person town, and they found like there were a handful of families that were saying like, we're leaving because there's no childcare here, and like that's tragic. Like that is 6 families, and family generationally in a town of 3,000 people is actually like a fairly significant number. And similarly, we think about families being able to have the number of kids they want to have, right? Like we know often cases, times like that discussion starts with, can we afford it? Is there any place they're going to be able to go to childcare, right? Like instead of what should be, which is like this conversation of like, is this something we want, right? Is this something that we would like to have, and we think would enrich our life experience and the life experience of our community. So this is what I mean when I say like those arguments have nothing to do with whether business productivity is going to improve as a result. There's nothing to do with whether we're going to see the female labor force participation, rise over time. Like those are secondary benefits. That's not the primary purpose. It's about having a society where everyone or every family has the ability to flourish and to thrive. And it's really hard to do that when you're under all of this stress and outside pressure that's actually restricting your choices. And that was a long monologue without even mentioning the words child development, which is a whole nother
Right.
piece of this puzzle.
Yeah, I was pausing for Tiff again because she did so much nodding back there.
And, I mean, the economic argument is such the focus, but it's like if you're really able to step back, we have a county here that has 0 licensed childcare providers and 0 illegal childcare providers, and they can't hire enough people to plow the roads. They just don't get plowed anymore because they can't have enough people in their community, because as soon as they start having families, they have to leave.
Yeah.
And they can't draw any new people in just to have a community because there's nowhere for their children to spend meaningful time.
Yeah, and that's
like economy aside, like public works fall apart, roads fall apart, everything falls apart.
Yep. But those people chose to have kids, so it's up to them to deal with it, right? No effect on anyone else.
God, yeah, we're gonna get called names for this one.
Good, bring it.
Oh, sorry, I got busy listening and forgot that I was supposed to also be guiding the conversation. One of the things that you referred to some stuff from a scholar named Emma Dowling, who I'd never heard of before. So but you said, you quoted her saying something that care is valorized but not valued. And how does that fit into this?
Yeah, right.
That was such a great turn of phrase.
I know.
Yeah.
Do you want
to take this one? Yeah.
All right.
That means that our childcare system is subsidized on the back of our child care workers.
You mean, yeah.
Right?
On the back of childcare, yeah.
Exactly that.
Yeah, on the child care workers, and we specifically should say on the backs of women, right, and mothers in particular, right? So, she is making that case. The fact is, if you think about all of and this is Emma Dowling, and I came across her in a book on elder care, which is another place where a lot of this comes, where they actually mirror a lot of childcare issues. But her point is that right? In most societies, American society, very much part of this, there is an expectation that that the care that is provided, often by women, we think it's really important, right? Like we're like, oh, those, moms are heroes, and right, like the stay-at-home mom, like, but then if you ask, great, can we compensate them? To your point, David, like the answer is absolutely not. There's some expectation because care has a component of love to it. It does not need to be met with compensation, that it's not labor in the same way. Often, care, the old line is like care work is coded as women's work and manufacturing work is coded as men's work, right? And so therefore you see vastly different levels of investment in those things. So yeah, that is a component of this. And I think we have this problem, which is that the market will never reward care. It will never reward care because of that issue of valorized but not valued. And it will never reward care because, and then I quote a guy from the UK, Jim Jackson, on this, that, it's not, care is not a productive work in the way that the free market capitalist thinks about it. Like it takes a long time provide. As we know, childcare programs have extremely low child to adult ratios. So, one person is caring for, 4 or 6 children, right? And so you're not going to see it. It doesn't really code into capitalist logic in the same way, as like have a car factory and I want to, get as much productivity out of that. Means that I want to have as few people as possible that I have to pay doing as much work as possible and producing as much product as possible so that I can maximize my profits. And when you try to layer that onto childcare, it falls apart. And so, but we're making return on investment arguments. Yeah. And so it's interesting when we're appropriating economic words and economic logic to make this case, when it actually, like, our sector doesn't fit into a traditional economic model.
Yeah.
And can we talk about the patriarchy again?
Always happy to.
Okay.
Always, all the time.
Great, thanks. Yeah. So there's also this, yes, we've got this amazing, it's like the whole premise of It's a Wonderful Life, right? Heather likes that movie. I've only seen it once or twice. That, like, I'm the working man and I work so hard and I've forgotten my family and I don't like, it's not good to work all the time. You got to care for your family. But then on the flip side, when it's women doing all this care work, and especially if you're working in somewhere like a childcare center or sometimes even in your home, and you're putting in that same level of, I've got to work all the time to make this happen. I'm working. And then there's this juxtaposition, right? Of like, but it's not good. Like society says it's bad to work all the time, but you're supposed to work all the time because it's care work. So then it's like, no matter how you divide this, you're just feeling bad about yourself all the time.
Yeah.
Like it's communicated that like this work isn't valued, but doing the work isn't valued. So what the hell?
Yeah. And, I think even just within the field of early childhood, early care and education, early childhood, whatever we're calling it, childcare work, there's such a divide just among those of us doing it, that also devalues care and play, because those are not seen as productive. They're less measurable. They're seen as soft things that any woman can do. And so why would we pay more for that? So, we're not necessarily doing ourselves any favors either with this economic argument. We're trying to use it to improve things for, ourselves as workers in the field, but we end up creating divides, I guess, is where I'll try to let that trail off.
We do. I mean, look at the way that I think the field has a very uncomfortable relationship with stay-at-home parents and relative caregivers, like friend, family, neighbor caregivers, right? Like I was at a taping of No One's Coming to Save Us, the podcast from Lemonada, the other weekend. There was a Colorado state representative who argue, and I never heard this argument before, but I think she's spot on. She says, actually, like, childcare deserts is an erroneous term. I'm paraphrasing her. She said it's licensed childcare deserts, but if you go to those childcare deserts, you know what there is? There's FFN care, there's friend, family, neighbor care. Like somebody's taking care of those kids. And so, like, when we talk all about childcare deserts, we're actually just making those folks invisible. I thought that was an interesting point, because yes, again, like, how do you measure, like, what is the return on investment of a grandmother taking care of her 1-year-old grandson? Like, that's not creating economic value. No one is going necessarily, right? Like, in fact, you might be taking that grandmother out of the workforce. Maybe she's a Walmart greeter. Now she's not anymore, right? Like, again, I don't want to say there's no room for this, because it can be a useful argument when it is targeted and used strategically. When it is our only argument, or our dominant argument, like, it really does. When you start to peel back the layers, you're like, huh, all sorts of unintended consequences. This is actually make it harder to fight for a system that works well for everyone.
Yeah. So I think that's a good segue to the next piece that I want to ask you about. So you talk about how if we're going to get away from this minimum viable childcare fallacy, we must do two things. The first is explicitly position childcare among higher ideals than a mere work enabler, which I think we've kind of been talking about for a while. And then you say the second is crafting policy proposals aligned with such a vision. And I know you have thoughts about what that would look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are, right, like, one thing we need to do when we think about those policy proposals is to be pluralistically inclusive. What I mean by that is, we need to think about childcare in all its dimensions. Stay-at-home parents need to be part of the conversation. FFN needs to be part of the conversation. School-age childcare needs to be part of the conversation. Definitely. And we've gotten to this point where I think it is fair to say, like, the lion's share of the policy attention goes to formal childcare programs and pre-K programs, right? Childcare centers and pre-K programs to some extent.
Because we can't just give money to anybody. It has to be measurably quality
right,
by someone's standard.
Exactly, which is really, and it is a challenge, it is a tension, right? Because, like, we can talk about, I don't know where you two sit on, like, the idea of qualifications and, like, credentials, degrees that we need early childhood teachers. That's a very open debate. And then, I often try to nuance it by saying, like, we're talking congregate care settings. I think it's probably fair to say need a different level of training and skill set than, like, taking care of your own kid, or, right, again, grandma taking care of their grandkid. But you're right, it does. We have to decide what childcare is. Like, this is what I come down to at some point, because I don't think America is ever going to get to the point where we have an expectation that, like, everyone from age 1 on is, like, basically, like, in a childcare program, which there are, places like Sweden, like, that basically is the case. And, like, I think that's just not the country that we are. So if it's going to be pluralistic, then the policy needs to be pluralistic, and it's not so much. And that's so I'll pause there. There are other things, but that's one of the big ones, I think, is number, like, if we have an answer for the stay-at-home parent question, it gets a lot easier to sell the rest of it, because that's the number, I don't know about you two, but, like, that's the number one thing I get pushed back on, like, by far and away. The number one is, like, what are we doing? And then, and I've talked to people, like, fairly conservative people, like, because in my book I talked about, like, let's pay stay-at-home parents,
right, which
is actually an idea that has, like, progressive roots, and feminist roots, and several of them were like, I don't love the idea of 1-year-olds in formal childcare, but, like, since you've got something for, like, stay-at-home parents, like, I could live with it. So I think that just opens more doors.
And there is an economic argument for that too. Like, if we're giving stay-at-home parents some of the money that's going around to solve this problem, that goes into the economy, right?
It
like
does.
they have more money, or they can do things that contribute. So it's a piece of the puzzle, but it has to be, I think, critically processed, sort of case by case almost, which makes it really hard to use just that economic argument as a problem solver.
And that's like, is the economic argument the one that's going to get us a foot in the door? And that's why we're focusing on it so much.
I think that's why we started to focus on it. Yeah, like you're saying, like I think that's where it came from, and it does, right? But it has. It's like, what do you do once you're in the door? Because of the question.
That to me is my like. Yes, everyone acknowledges that our childcare system is not functioning. It's broken. We have broken.
Yep.
But what is the next step on the journey to start untangling this mess that people can say yes to without feeling like we're like inventing the wheel overnight, you know? Like, what are the actionable steps to that future that centers can take, that family providers can take? Like, how do we get there? We all acknowledge this would be great. Wouldn't it be great?
Yeah.
But how?
Yeah. Well, right. And how do you convince the lawmakers that actually like this is worth investing in? So this is not just a minimum wage job, poverty level job, right? Like that actually makes sense to invest in, early childhood educators as middle class, salaries with benefits. I think, to put a really fine point on this, I think it's interesting to note that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is the nation's largest lobbying organization, and which its sort of nonprofit foundation arm regularly puts out reports about the childcare crisis and how much it's costing businesses and states, right? Like, so they have sort of are the, I guess, epitome of the economic argument, right? And they're also an organization that spent 7 figures on ad campaigns and lobbying expenses against the Build Back Better Act, right? Which would have invested $400 billion in the US childcare system. So it is this thing where you're like, the economic argument gets you in the door, but then the next sentence is, and therefore we need to a dedicated funding source that's going to probably include some taxes.
Yeah.
You suddenly like, where'd everyone go?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's scary for me whenever I'm listening to politicians or any kind of policy making conversation locally that the obvious answer is more national investment, but also I don't want you in here telling me how to do it every day. So it's super scary. And I think that's also why some of us pull back out of the advocacy that we could be doing, is that we're like, well, if I continue to struggle on like I'm struggling on, at least I can do it the way I want to.
Yeah. That's another policy question, right? Like, how do you design it such that, there is enough autonomy, remaining in programs, and you have some amount of floor of quality, but that you're not being super prescriptive. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. I just lost what I was going to say.
Oh, is this where we get to talk about how there should be national licensing regulations? Do you want to talk about that, Elliot? Tiffany?
I don't know. Did I say that? Have I said that?
No, I don't think you did. I think Tiffany just wants to bring it up.
Tiffany,
I bring it up a lot.
Yeah.
I bring it up a lot because when you think about something like CPR, that every single provider and school teacher and like many forward-facing public employees have to take every year, there are these huge organizations like Red Cross, and every time you get your CPR recertification, you are recertified and you know the basics. Yet when you think about childcare, we wash tables differently in Washington than we do in Oregon.
Yeah.
And like, how many of those nuances are holding back this bigger, like, hey, you should fund us argument? Because then when you start looking at childcare, it's a total shit show of like, well, nobody knows what they're doing. And we don't have any, like, talking about qualifications and backgrounds, like, you can have 12 kids on your own in South Dakota, but you can't have a single one in Washington. And so like, there's so much disjointed, what would that mean to fund? Because like, as a field, we don't have any logical national standards in that way.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm of like 2 minds on that question. Like on the one hand, I absolutely agree with you. And I think that actually like many states have regulations that are kind of ridiculous, right? Like whether it's, the amount of the inches of mulch cover you have to have, or the
Can't use sand in Washington, but you can in California.
right. So like, yeah, sure. Like, and then also like the fact, like, I'm very aware that anything that feels like a DC power grab, right? Like, even if it's not, is always going to be met with significant resistance. So I think if there were to be that, then you'd be really thoughtful about like what are the must-haves, right? Like, what are the things that you because I actually think some of the grand bargain could be, and we're going to reduce some of this unnecessary regulation. I mean, I don't think any of us think that fixing regulation is going to fix childcare. Like, obviously, like, it's funding, but I don't think, I am sympathetic, especially talking to people in the field, that like it makes it unnecessarily difficult. And, and plenty of times I've heard and talked to people who've said like, I know someone who wanted to start a childcare program, started the process, and then said, absolutely not. This is a hot mess. I'm out, So yeah, it's it should be a piece of the conversation. I agree with you there.
I think that there's so much that could be said about childcare reform because this comes back around to that minimum viable product mindset, not just for the whole field, but like for a center. What is the minimum viable product that is a childcare center? Mm-hmm. And it's like, there are universal health and safety standards that like shouldn't be a state decision.
Yeah.
Like I said with the washing tables is always my example. In Washington, you have to rinse the soap off with water first before you can bleach. But like, how is that not universal? That should be universal. And that should be the minimum standard. But then the next question is, what's the minimum efficiency? What's the minimum quality that providers have access to? And I think once those minimum viable standards are met, like, it frees up all of this time and space and money to focus on quality, because we're not thinking about like, well, in Tennessee, this bottom floor counted, but in North Carolina, it doesn't. Like, there's no way out of this mess right now. Money doesn't fix it all the way, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
No, it is what it's the phrase, necessary but not sufficient. It's a prerequisite to, and because on the flip side, we can fix regulation, all the regulations, make them perfect tomorrow when we'd still be in a giant mess. But like, and actually that's something that states could be doing now while we're kind of at a lull of any kind of major federal action, right? Like, that could be an interesting thing. Say, sometimes ask me like, what could we be doing right now given the sort of divided government? And that's one answer, is like, take a real hard look, audit those regulations, form some multi-state collaboratives and look at them. I think get into politics quickly about like it's a perfectly reasonable point. We have to get our systems in place. I think we don't, had Build Back Better passed, it still would have been a struggle, because we wouldn't have had necessarily the regulatory implementations frameworks sort of in place that we need, as we saw with the difficulty many states had even getting their, ARPA money and everything else out the door, right? Like, data systems, another example, right? Like, most places, we don't even know in many states, like, how many childcare providers there are and where they are. And, like, it can be really difficult just to like sort of that basic nuts and bolts stuff. So yeah, I think that definitely needs to be happening in parallel to the rest of it.
There's a lot of pieces in here. I'm trying to decide if I have, maybe not. I was going to go down the qualifications road a little bit. But I think that's a part of it too, because we assume that if we get everyone degreed who's doing the work, then naturally some more money will flow into the system somehow. And full disclosure, I'm a early childhood program chair at a community college, so of course I want people to get degrees, but I've also worked in the field long enough to know that the degree doesn't guarantee quality or money. That money follows.
Right.
No.
Yeah, I mean,
what happens is then you get into so much student loan debt that you will never be able to pay off in your entire lifetime in this year.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I had
we gotta fix that too before childcare is fixed.
I worked in when I was working in, some years back, we were working on early childhood degree programs, and I had an interesting conversation with the Higher Education Authority that was like, we're not sure we can accredit these because it doesn't meet our gainful employment standards. Like basically like what we can't tell students to go major in this because they're going to make poverty wages. And so that like violates some regulation. And I was like, wow, that's a problem. Like if it's, I think it's what the second percentile, maybe the single lowest degree, it may win the award.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think my biggest thing on this has always been, we have to be able to decouple training from degrees, right? Like, and K-12 doesn't want to talk about this, but frankly has this issue as well. If you ever dig into the research on, the correlation between degrees and teacher performance, particularly at the elementary school level, is less than we would commonly think. But professional development, like high quality training, absolutely has, influence. So like, that's always my thing on this is like, you don't want the 17-year-old who is, babysat a few times, like to be here. Here's a classroom of 8 2-year-olds. Good luck, right? Like that's the problem. That's when we run about. You also don't want to say to 17-year-old, go get a bachelor's degree in early childhood education and come back and talk to us in 4 years. Necessarily, think you're somewhere in the middle, right? Where you're like, we need you to have a path such that you understand child development, you understand classroom management, like you understand how to like run that classroom effectively of 8 2-year-olds. And then like, hopefully you'll have mentorship, right, from veteran teachers, and you'll have like career ladders, like all the things we would want. But I think sometimes we get so caught in the question of like degree or, bachelor's, associate's, CDA, like what is it? We don't start with the question of like, what's the outcome we're going for? And then what leads us into this outcome? And that's for the young teachers. That's before talking about the veteran teachers, right? Like the 50 and 60 plus year olds, women who've been doing this work and doing it damn well,
right?
But who might not speak English. And so like, then we're going to say, unless you get like, unless you have a degree. So it's very complicated. And I think it doesn't lend itself well to talking points. It doesn't lend itself well to simple answers. And so therefore,
and policies driven by simple answers. It seems like,
So, but again, like all of this comes down to, in my mind, because to go back to like the original thing, if we're starting from a place of saying like, we want a high quality, stable, childcare system with all sorts of options for parents to be able to get the care that they want and need, then like we're going to need a robust workforce that is not making $14 an hour, and 40% of them aren't walking out the door every year, right? Like, and that's not going to happen just by nudging up from 14 to 15 to $16 an hour, right? Like it's not going to happen unless we say like, this is going to require permanent dedicated funding streams. And here's why, like that we require that, right? Because we want to have healthy families, and we want to have healthy kids, and we want families to be able to like spend time, with each other and passing on their values and their stories and having, church picnics instead of like freaking the freak out because like their childcare program gave them 1 week's notice that they're closing, which was just the article yesterday, one in Iowa City that did this, right? Like, and like, it just, the system we need is so far from the system that we have. But the economic argument actually is not a path to the system that we need. It's a path to a slightly less terrible system that we currently have.
So I need to wrap up, even though this is super fun and I can keep going, keep listening. Are there any like last thoughts that you want to throw out before we wind down here, Elliot?
I mean, I think the practically speaking, right? Like some of this shift really is going to be people on the ground, advocates starting to incorporate new language. And so I sort of suggest some different ways you might make that argument in the piece. I think but I would just, I guess, encourage listeners, like think about making the like return on investment, parents need to work. This is going to help the economy argument, just like one arrow in your quiver, and like make sure you've got other ones there too, because I think the language shift, we've seen it, right? We've already, like, everyone talks about it as a public good now, or increasingly we're hearing people argue for it to be a right. I think that wasn't the case 10 years ago.
Right.
So language shifts when people start shifting the language, to be a little bit simplistic about it. So that's why my last point is like, this isn't purely theoretical. Like there are actually things that we can all do in our sort of day-to-day conversations.
Yeah. And so if people want to find more from you, the book again is Crawling Behind, America's Childcare Crisis and How to Solve It, I think, right?
So yeah. Yep.
And fix it. And then this piece came from Early Learning Nation, which is a is it online?
Yes, Early Learning Nation's online. Yes, earlylearningnation.com. I write a monthly column there.
And where else can they get you though?
Those are the easiest places. If you want to talk to me, I'm on, Twitter, X, whatever that thing's called now, at ehaspel. I'm on LinkedIn. My email is ehaspel@gmail.com. I'm easy to find, so always happy to talk to folks, and and thank you both, and thanks your listeners for all the work you all are doing. So
and thank you so much for being so persistent. and
thank you for the work you do.
The work you're doing is really I think important, and I really appreciate it. I know Tiffany does too.
Same.
Well, thank you both.
All right, well, thanks everybody for listening to another episode of That Early Childhood Nerd. We'll see you again next week.
Bye.